Thank you. Thank you very much. It's actually my third time here with YOW, and this year I'm particularly happy because, as Dave alluded to, I'm in the middle of a major transition, not only in terms of companies, but also all my things are in a container, hopefully right now, crossing the ocean as I'm moving from Munich to Singapore. So I'm very pleased to be able to actually make it down here while I'm in sort of an intercontinental move. As you can see from my affiliation, right, I'm also in a professional transition. So most of what I want to talk about today is about my 5-year experience as a chief architect at Allianz. So a little bit over 5 years ago, I was hired as the head of enterprise architecture. And to be honest, I didn't even really know at that time what enterprise architecture was. And this whole head of thing also confused me because I was always not sure, what do all the other body parts do if I'm just the head of this thing, right? So I had a lot of questions. But over time and over 5 years, I realized that as much fun as we make out of enterprise architects and architecture, it is actually an extremely interesting and valuable function, especially for companies who are undergoing a rapid change, which these days is many of the large organizations. So I came to conclude that enterprise architecture really has sort of two major problems or challenges. Right? And the first one is really, people think of it, the enterprise architects are the people who just sit in the ivory tower. Right? They draw pretty pictures, give great speeches, boxes and lines diagrams, and if something really goes wrong, they say, well, implementation issues. Right? So that's problem number one, and unfortunately, sometimes this perception is actually reality. I've seen enterprise architecture departments like this. I don't call this enterprise architecture, right? I call this sort of, looking good, based on other people's work. This is not what enterprise architecture is about. The second challenge is that many enterprise architects believe they're this guy, right? So it's like, this is, the chief architect makes all decisions, designs, has the complete overview, etc. And the irony of this is that in a large organization that can be a little bit political or also risk averse, actually other people sometimes also like the chief architect to look like this, because it's kind of handy if somebody else makes all the difficult decisions, all the big decisions, right? Because if something is wrong, well, it was that guy and not me. Right? So this is another unfortunately, very popular anti-pattern that sort of distorts what enterprise architecture is really about. So what I'll do is debunk this a little bit, right, and explain what I think the real role of enterprise architecture is and why that is such a valuable thing to do. So first, we need to understand that as enterprise architects, we generally think about the IT side. Right? Most folks here, if they carry the title architects, will be IT architects, like software architects, cloud architects, infrastructure architects. But of course, that is only part of the business, right? Usually IT costs money, and the money comes from somewhere else. It comes from the business, right? The vast majority of us will be working for business. So if we start talking about architecture and sort of building and designing systems, the interesting thing is, well, who does that for the business side? Right? There must be somebody who also designs and architects the business. And in fact, there's a whole discipline, and recently there's more events and writing about it, called business architecture. But in many organizations, you will find very few people who have the title business architect, and that is because those folks are usually the senior business executives. Right? There will be division heads, division leads, vice presidents, chief operating officers. Those are the folks who design and architect the business, and I often feel like there's actually a nice symmetry on it. They architect the business, and we architect the IT to support that business. And then the enterprise architecture is really that makes sure that this matches together. Because the most nice and elegant IT solution doesn't make any sense if it doesn't have the alignment with the business, right? This is where everything starts or falls apart. It also means that in organizations where the business and the business architecture are very close to each other, you don't need a whole ton of enterprise architecture. Unfortunately, or luckily, depending how you look at it, that is usually not the case, right? So you need enterprise architecture sort of as a glue, as a connecting element. Let me move that cursor out of the way there. Hold on. Oops, there we go. Right? So in the end, it's about the ultimate role of enterprise architecture is to make sure that connection is in place. Now, when we talk about enterprises and how things work in a large enterprise, we'll often like to think about value chains. Right? A value chain is to make sure that a series of individual activities ultimately lead to value for the business. And I think using that metaphor for enterprise architecture is quite appropriate, right? There's a lot of things you could be doing, right? And many other folks at the conference, Jeff Patton, et cetera, talked about generating user value and impact. And I don't think it's any different for enterprise architecture. So when I show the steps here, or the pieces of enterprise architecture, this is not a recipe, right? It's actually a fairly complex domain, but I rather think of it as a value chain, right? These are the pieces that have to come together in order to make enterprise architecture valuable for the business. There's a young enterprise architect in the audience. The other property we have about value chains, the reason it's called a chain is that if one piece is missing, the chain breaks, right? This is the sort of the special and sometimes unhappy property of chains, right? So that they have a weakest link. So basically, in the end, you need to be aware of the fact that you need all these pieces for this whole thing to work and function together. So what I'm going to do in the first half of my talk, sort of run through these and explain a little bit what this looks like in a real, extremely large enterprise. Right, so Allianz being a large insurance company, 145,000 people, 130 billion euros revenue in that order of 11 billion profit all over the planet, right? Very large and complex organizations. So let's start with the beginning, and it sounds terribly obvious, but if you want to do enterprise architecture and come up with an IT strategy, well, the very first thing you should do is understand the business strategy. And you'll find that in large organizations, this is A, not trivial, and B, it's extremely interesting, right? And I've done this in my past. I traveled through Asia with Allianz to understand how do the markets differ? Where are the growth markets? Where's the revenue generated? Generating revenue doesn't necessarily mean it's the most profitable division. How do they have different business lines and products across different countries and regions? So for example, it turns out in Asia, it's a lot of life insurance that they have. Only in Malaysia does Allianz have a significant property and casualty business. Different distribution channels, distribution networks. Sometimes insurance is sold through banks, sometimes through agents, sometimes through brokerage, right? This has a big impact ultimately on your IT architecture. Because as we'll see, architecture is a lot about making assumptions and building flexibility in your system. So only by understanding the business can you have a feeling for what flexibility actually provides value to the business. And if you think the business itself is not interesting enough, the organization will certainly be. In these large organizations, international organizations, there will be holding companies, there will be business divisions. In Allianz's case, there's a lot of country divisions because usually insurance licenses are issued by country. But then there's also global business lines, right, that do business around the globe because they deal with large corporations or travel insurance that makes little sense to have in a single country. So you find that sort of modeling the organizational domain in the end almost has the same complexity as the business domain. The good news about this, you might sort of wonder, is like, well, isn't this somebody else's job, right? Why do I, as architect, have to worry about this? And I said, first, right, because this is where the story starts. If this misaligns, right, everything else won't make up for it. And B, you'll find most businesses are actually really interesting, right? So when you think about insurance, most people don't go to work for an insurance company because it's so exciting, right? Insurance is pretty stable, pretty boring. In my case, the company was like 127 years old, right? It's kind of sort of business as usual. But once you dig a little bit deeper, you find that most businesses are really much more interesting and much more rich than you expect. So for give an example, in an insurance case, it's not about sort of buying homeowner insurance, and then if your bicycle gets stolen, they won't pay anyway because there's a fine print somewhere in the insurance policy, right? But they insure large, for example, corporate installations, aircraft, oil drilling platforms, those kind of things. And you start to realize that in those cases, if something goes massively wrong, the customer doesn't want just the money. The customers want crisis management, right? And this can be technical crisis management, or this can be reputational, right? Like things go wrong, people poison food, etc. All this stuff has happened. Companies are insured against that. They need crisis management. So insurance companies do a lot more than just sit and wait and pay money later, right? They actively help the customers manage major crises, right? Because ultimately they have a vested interest because the quicker they solve the problem, the less the damage is afterwards. Or to give another example, Allianz has folks who do turbine engineering for like power stations. You're like, why would an insurance company employ people like this? Well, it's very easy. If you're trying to insure a major industrial installation, they don't just like send you an insurance form and like fill out your name and your coverage, right? They go and have a close look at what you actually have. And they will do safety inspections. Right? So they basically review your drilling platform, your power stations, whatever you have, and they will have their own demands, right? They will have their own conversations about, does this meet their safety expectations? Because otherwise, they won't insure you. So in the end, you'll find, and this is true for most other business domains, once you sort of peel back the onion a little bit, it is much richer, much more interesting than you would have thought. And insurance is a great example. So this is where it starts, right? You need to understand what your business does so you can make a matching IT strategy. But before you get there, there's a very important step, and this is often forgotten. And that is, what does your business actually think of the IT? Now, that seems a very trivial question, right? So of course, IT is the one who runs all the hardware, software, etc. But from a business point of view, right, they might have very different views. Why does IT exist in most large enterprises? Well, it exists because it automated manual processes, right? Insurance used to be very paper-based, right? Claim forms and contracts and stuff. So IT automated that, but that is largely done, right? They all have a finance system, they have a claim system, an accounting system, right? And it's like, that stuff is just there, and it has relatively high run cost. Yeah, in a large company like Allianz, some of this is in the billions of dollars, right, a year, so big money. So they look at IT largely as a cost center, right? If they can keep this running for less money, they will be quite happy, right? So it's just about making IT spend less money because, largely what IT was meant to do, they already did. Now, interestingly, often you can read in an organization what this view is, and I'll talk about the other ones in a second, is by the reporting line of the CIO. So usually in an IT organization, the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, is sort of the most important person in IT. It's also a very difficult job. So many people joke that it stands for career is over, right? Or people say the most important thing in the CIO's contract is the severance package, right? Because CIO is supposed to cut costs, be on the brink of technology, support the business, yada, yada. They don't have an easy job. Now, interestingly, in many organizations, the CIO, even though it's such a stressful job, don't report directly to the CEO. Right? So often they will report to the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer. Now, what does a Chief Financial Officer do? Well, that person basically writes the checks, to simplify a little bit. So they look at cost. They don't look so much at opportunity. So if you look at an organizational chart and the CIO reports to the Chief Financial Officer, that is an indication that they think of IT largely as a cost. Right? And we come to this, the way you start selling things to the business very much depends on this view. So let's see what some other stages are. So the cost part is one, and here whether you like it or not, if it's just about cost, the logical conclusion is to outsource the IT. Because you can get the same thing for cheaper. If that's all you have, sure, you should do this. It's like electricity out of the plug, right? If you can get it for 2 cents less per kilowatt hour, you should switch the provider and get it for less. Now, as I said, you may like this or more likely don't like this, right? But if it's really a pure cost, that is the logical thing to do. The dangerous aspect, of course, is that the correct model, right? Are we really IT on the left-hand side? So many organizations have realized that IT is more than just a cost center and that there's an opportunity to save costs on other things. So they automate more processes, they streamline and harmonize, and they see IT as an asset. And that might sound like a trivial distinction, but it's a huge step ahead, right? Because an asset is something that you invest into, and you get a return on investment, right? So give a simple example. Let's say if your car and you're purely cost-driven, you don't get the oil change. Right? Because it's another cost, right? The car will still run. You saved $80 or $100, right? That's if you're purely cost-driven. Now, you might say, oh, that is not a very clever thing to do because you understand the system and what will happen, right? But if you're purely cost-driven, that's the easiest way to save cost. Now, in the second one, that would be, of course, you get your oil changes because there's a very good return on investment on your oil change because your car will live much longer. So this might sound like a trivial distinction, but it's actually a huge step forward because it gives you the ability to invest. Largely, those companies have the CIO reporting to the COO. It's called the Chief Operations Officer. I also sometimes say Chief Optimization Officer. These are the people who make sure the business runs well and runs efficiently. And the CIO reporting in there is a clear sign that IT is a part of getting the business to run efficiently, and efficient means you get a good return on investment. And often this is governed by economies of scale. Right? Because these investments, you can amortize better the bigger you are. Right? Allianz was a great example of this, 145,000 people, divisions all over the planet. So they were very happy with this model because they could amortize their IT investment very well. Now, recently, people have realized that IT's purpose is not just to get the shop to run more quickly or to more smoothly, but actually to unlock new opportunities. That's what digitalization is all about. I always joked that Allianz is like a 127-year-old business, that they had plenty of time to find all business models that can be done without technology, right? Come on, 127 years, right? So that they figured out. So now going forward, all new business models that they come up with are technology enabled. And the use cases are fairly obvious. What does insurance do these days? A lot of IoT. Because insurance insures things, so knowing more about these things is quite valuable. So this is like telematics, pay as you drive, pay how you drive. So basically how much you drive with your car and the way you drive with your car. Those things can impact insurance policies. A lot of health monitoring, all these kind of things, right? So a lot of stuff going on there. And that sort of moves IT to the right-hand side. And there you have some other folks coming into play. And that's often a CDO, a Chief Digital Officer. And that is usually a sign that people start to realize that technology for them is not just sort of business as usual and getting the business to run more efficiently, but it's actually something that unlocks new opportunities. Right? And if you play this a little further, often you'll have the CIO reporting to the CEO directly, and that is a sign that for them, IT is really a big driver and enabler of the business. And at that point, you find that people actually stop talking about IT and business. In 7 years at Google, I was before, nobody ever said, oh, we should talk to the business, right? The distinction just did not exist. And interestingly, when I joined Allianz, some people came to me and said, well, Google is a technology company, we are an insurance company. And I always said, well, it's funny you would say that because Google is an advertising company. Right? I work in Google Cloud. I sure wish we were more of a technology company because, trying to sell more cloud products, 90-some% of Google's revenue is advertising. So advertising and insurance isn't all that different. They're both services companies. It's just Google has understood how to make technology an integral part of their business model, and insurance is still in the process of figuring this out. Last important part on the right-hand side is once people realize that the value of IT is bringing innovation and new products, they realize it's no longer about economies of scale, but it's economies of speed. It's how quickly can you get things on the market and how quickly can you iterate. And this is the only reason large companies have to be so afraid of disruption, right? Because if the world is run by economies of scale, if you're a 130 billion euro organization, you would not have to worry at all, right? Because economies of scale are extremely hard to attack. But the rules of the game have shifted, right? And it's economies of speed. It's about release cycles, etc. And large companies that have good economies of scale usually are slow, so they have poor economies of speed. And that's why they have to be so afraid of disruption. And this is, again, where enterprise architecture comes in to help with that. Now, the interesting thing is why this is so important to understand is, so let's say you're an architect and you paid great attention at this event and you learned out about continuous integration, continuous delivery, Docker container, microservices, all the kind of stuff you have, right? And you try to sell this to your organization. Said, oh, of course we need CI/CD. If your organization is on the left-hand side, you will just bang your head against the wall because you're selling speed to an organization that's cost-driven. Right? And of course, the new technology, regardless whether it's open source or not, it will cost money. Right? You need new skill set, training, new people, new hardware, etc. So the CFO will just hear, oh my God, right? I heard this with client server, I heard this with the web, I heard this every time, and every time the IT just costs more money. So you cannot sell speed to somebody who is cost-driven. Now you can do two things. You can change their view of IT, right? And make them understand this, and that's something you should do, but that takes time. Or you need to make sure your message lines up with their view of IT. So if you want to sell Docker containers, let's say, you don't come with a CI/CD and speed angle, you come with a hardware utilization angle. Right? Say, oh, with lightweight containers, look, more stuff fits on one machine, so all this expensive hardware we buy, is more highly utilized. Or we can harmonize our tooling, we need less diverse tooling because everything looks like a Docker container, so we save money there. That is something a CFO or a CIO reporting to a CFO can understand, but they won't appreciate the speed argument if they live in the world of cost cutting and economies of scale. So it's very important to get this right, because everything that follows will fall apart if this is not aligned. And the usual symptoms of this is not being aligned is the architects coming and saying, oh, business doesn't understand, they don't fund my projects, they don't want. That is the usual symptoms, because you're not speaking the language of the expectation your upper management has. So if that is out of whack, everything else won't work. So let's assume we get this right. Now we need to formulate a strategy, right? And you see often these motivational posters, we provide the best service at the lowest cost. Well, that is not a strategy. That's like, we're going to win this race. That's the wishful outcome, right? That's the desired outcome. That is not a strategy, right? The strategy is supposed to tell you, well, how are you going to get there? What are you not doing, right? Faster, better, cheaper is not a strategy, right? That's wishful thinking. So you need to make an emphasis. Are we a premium provider or a low-cost provider, right? And if you are one or the other, you're not the opposite. Right? So that's the most important, sort of first stumbling stone in the strategy. The other one is strategy is not reality. Sounds obvious, but I had that challenge many times as chief architect. So one of our strategy was we containerize as much as we can, right? I mean, you would say not maybe a very creative strategy, but sort of at the high level business, right? That is our IT deployment strategy for infrastructure. People raise their hand immediately and say, well, not every application we have can be containerized. That does not invalidate the strategy, right? That is the gap between where you want to be and where you are, and that is fine, right? It is not reality. And the third part is equally important is, a lot of large IT is, they tend to be buy versus build organizations, right? The Allianz is an insurance company at the end of the day, so they tend to buy a lot of their technology, and that's good so. But what that also leads to is that there's a huge impact from the vendors. Right, and they do their job very quickly, and they show all the roadmaps, they inject all the kind of ideas they have, right? So it's very tempting to take the vendor product roadmap to be sort of a substitute for your strategy. And I think especially in today's day and age, that's fatal, right? You need to have your own IT strategy and know where you want to go, and you map that to what the vendors offer you. And it either matches or it doesn't match, and that's how you make your purchasing decision, right? If your strategy comes from the vendor, oh wonder, their product will line up perfectly with your strategy. How convenient, right? For the vendor, not for your enterprise, right? So you need to have your own view of where you want to go with this. So zooming in a little bit, here's an example. So this is one of the earliest books on enterprise architecture. Right? There's a lot of stuff in there that's a little bit outdated, but there's one really good diagram. And it shows a high-level translation between a business operating model and the kind of IT that you want to have. So this one I need to explain a little bit. We don't need to worry about all the detail, but basically it has two axes. Right? What the business operating model looks like. And the two axes differ by how highly standardized the business is and by how highly integrated the business. So I'll give you an example, right? Like McDonald's or a hotel chain, they're highly standardized. They're like cookie cutter, like these franchises, right? Like one looks like the other, but they're not highly integrated because they operate fairly independently. You probably have some financial rollout at the end, but each McDonald's and each hotel is basically its own business. So they would be on the bottom right. You see like Marriott there as an example, right? Versus something that's more highly integrated is something that as an enterprise has a long value chain, but that is coordinated. So like oil and gas is a great example, right? They do everything from like, going through the jungle and desert to find oil until, refinery market, exploration. They put this on a ship, they have transport, they have refineries, they have trading, they have retail, until the thing gets into the gas pump, but they're highly interdependent, right? They're integrated. These things don't work independently. Right, and you found businesses where you have neither, like GE or Siemens, they do everything under the sun, right? They're not standardized, integrated, and you will find some business that are both. Long story short, the kind of IT system at a high-level architecture you want to have depends on this. right? So if you have a high level of replication, you can make standardized applications. You can have the McDonald's French fry management application, whatever they have, right? And a hotel management booking, hotel management system, and you can replicate that. And that is a very nice thing to do for IT. If it's not so highly standardized, at best you can probably do is give them a common infrastructure to run on, because the applications they need will be quite different. Likewise, if it's highly integrated, data integration, common databases, data stores, or generally enterprise integration becomes much more interesting because it provides more value to a business that has an integrated business model, right? So integrating the data or integrating the system will provide value to them, versus if they are from a business perspective disconnected, the integration doesn't help much. So this is a great example. You might think this is pretty lofty pie in the sky, but again, if things are out of whack here, the largest projects, right, people spend tens of millions or sometimes more on integration and data lakes and shared data warehouses. If that is not what provides the biggest value for the business, that is a guaranteed way that these projects will ultimately tank, regardless how good the technical architecture is. Right? So this is a fantastic example where you classify the business operation model and make the translation into the matching IT strategy. So let's go to the next one. So now you know where you want to go. Now you need to find out where you are. And unfortunately, more often than not, you get a picture like this, right? So you might not like what you see, but in the end, you need to get some transparency. In large enterprises, even getting this is a giant challenge, right? The international, different divisions, different organizations, different vendors. So getting some transparency is a huge step forward. On this picture, I always joke that this is actually a fantastically highly scalable stateless architecture. Because look, the database is in the bottom left, and there's absolutely no connection to it, right? So if you think, and it's highly integrated, right? So it's like it matches the integrated business model, right? So yeah, so all jokes aside, getting reality is the precondition to charting out a roadmap. Because if you don't have the starting point, the vision doesn't help you. You'll quickly wear yourself out and saying, oh, we should be all in the cloud, containerized, CI/CD, la, 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 la. People will get very tired. People want to know how you're going to get from here to there. In Melbourne, there was, Simon was giving a talk about what is it like to be a CTO. And he said, what is dope for management? What does management always want to see? And his answer was they want to see a plan. Right? And we as architects or as IT folks, we're very much geared to showing the target state. We are there to show solutions. Look, it's all going to be fantastic, right? I have my Dockerized Jenkins farm and this and that, Docker Swarm, Kubernetes, la la la. Everything will be fine, and management will go like, he went to another IT conference again, right? Heard all the fancy stuff. Yeah, leave me alone. So management wants to see a plan. They want to see a roadmap. So when you make this translation, right, when you go to the target picture and the roadmap, it works well to show before and after. And even I made that mistake many, many times. We like to show only the after version, because that's what we're generally paid for. But for management, you lose them very quickly. Also, it makes for a much better storyline. It makes for a bit more suspense. If you say, look, this is where we are, here's the problem, here's where we want to go, and here's what's going to be better. So this is a real example. It might seem like a very simple example, but it's a real example. We're saying, what is our biggest problem? Biggest problem is that the applications are in silos. And I'm not talking about the data isolation here, right? I'm talking about its duplication. Each of them have their own runtime automation, their own tool chain, their own testing frameworks, their own monitoring frameworks, right? Each large application in this insurance business came with all the bells and whistles. And that has two problems. The one thing is, this is huge duplication. This costs money. And B, none of this provides any business value. Right? You don't sell a single insurance policy because of your monitoring framework, right? Like any other monitoring framework will largely be as good. So the key part of the strategy is to move the things of the bottom stack into a common runtime platform. So common tool chain, common deployment, common runtime platform, because at the end of the day, that's not where the differentiator is, and let the applications focus on functionality, not on runtime infrastructure. And then you can see in the third step that this is also a precondition to breaking these applications down into smaller, maybe you want to call it microservices, but into smaller pieces. Because on the left-hand side, well, with a lot of money, you can still kind of get away with it. It's not a clever thing to do, but if you just bankroll it, you'll be fine. On the right-hand side, if you don't do this for 3 applications, but for 20, 30, 100 or more services, each of them having their own deployment, testing, monitoring, etc. framework, runtime framework, right, that will just grind you to a halt. Now, if you look at this and say like, oh, this is actually fairly, I don't want to say trivial almost, right? This makes a lot of sense. There's the nice quote, and I actually looked it up. It's from Blaise Pascal. There's a famous quote that says, I was going to write you a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time. Right? And this was actually Pascal, the one the programming language was named after, so one of ours, if you wish. Right? And the same is true with enterprise architecture. To come to the simple message, to get stuff to the essence, that management, that the CFO can see, oh yeah, all these big green boxes, yeah, you make these smaller, huh? This saves me money, yeah, sorry to say, right? This is at the level you need to work, and at the same time making sure that this actually has some technical merit, and doing this in a compact format is actually not easy, right? So I spent a lot of my time, this wasn't the first picture I drew there, I spent quite a bit of time to really make the shortest letter. Right? And this is another, I would say, important lesson to be learned. Like, condense down the message, stay true to the technical nature, right? This is not BS, right? But come to saying, this is the biggest problem we have right now, and the key strategy and roadmap is, to put this runtime platform in, and as you can see on the right-hand side, once we have this runtime platform and abstraction, this also serves as a basis for a hybrid cloud strategy. Yeah, they're sort of hitting the on-premise, off-premise there, because once you have that, right, it's more easy to shift workload in and out, private cloud and public cloud, right? And this is what a lot of the Kubernetes, Docker kind of things help us do. Another real example is governance, right? So now you have the roadmap laid out. As we said, management likes plans and roadmaps. So we have that. Now the G word governance comes in. What is governance, right? Governance is basically what is so people don't goof off, right? It's sort of to make sure that the reality follows the roadmap. And it's not an easy thing to do, because often it's seen as an extra hurdle. Right? It's like when somebody says, oh, I'm here to do governance, people quickly get busy. Right? It's like, oh, I have something else to do. Right? I once heard the joke, like the 3 biggest lies in the world are, I love you forever, the check is in the mail, and I'm from headquarters, I'm here to help you. Right? So this is the governance, right? It's like, yeah, I'm here from headquarters. Right? So in the end, though, this is another real picture. We said, how do we deal with governance, right? So if you see this simplified stack, so infrastructure, platform, applications, customization, where's the business value? Right? Does your customer care what infrastructure you run on? As long as the stuff is running, probably not. But they care about your features and customizations and tailoring to the local market or to their needs, right? So the business value is clearly on top. So one thing we realized, and this is an Allianz example, is that we have a huge level of diversity. I mean, basically, you name it, we have it. Right? So Allianz owns everything. So there's a huge level of diversity at the bottom, but at the same time, at the top, the applications often lack flexibility. Right? And people from the local markets always complain and say, well, your insurance system doesn't really serve my local market because I'm in Taiwan, or I'm in Bangkok, I'm in Thailand, or I'm in the US, or I'm in Germany. We just have slightly different needs. So my view was that that is exactly the wrong way around, because you have too much guidance where business value could be generated, and a little bit more diversity would provide business value. But at the bottom of the stack, right, in the infrastructure, where it would be very hard to make the argument that that sells insurance policies, right, there you have a huge diversity. So in the end, what you want to do is, that's where you want to start to govern, where you want to reduce diversity. Right? For example, give a real example. People always came to us as like, oh, your virtual servers don't meet our needs. I'm just, okay, why would that be? Oh, I need more RAM per CPU. And my answer is, well, in a scale-out architecture, you just get more machines, right? There you go, you have more RAM. What's wrong with the architecture? Right? Should deal with this. Well, in many cases, in this particular example, it turned out it was the licensing model that gave them a headache. Right? Because the reason they wanted so much RAM per CPU was because they get billed by core, by the vendor. So they want to load these machines up with as much RAM as possible so they can eke every little bit of performance out of that CPU, because if they add another core, they will bill dearly. So my answer was just like, well, we don't have an architecture problem, we have a licensing problem. Right? Go talk with the vendor, right? This doesn't match our strategy. Our strategy is a scale-out architecture with harmonized infrastructure. If your licensing model doesn't work with this, well, we need to have a serious talk, right? You shouldn't be on our strategic roadmap if you can't fix this. So this is the way, you drive business with enterprise architecture. Coming back to the hurdle, so nobody likes governance, right? It's like checkpoints, architecture review boards, right? Who here loves going to architecture review boards? Yeah, exactly. Not even me, right? I lower my hand, right? This is something you don't want to go to because people come with extra hurdles, right? At the same time, we found that an architecture review board can also provide value. Concrete example, somebody showed a network architecture, sort of, leaf and spine, sort of classic network, top of rack switches, yada, yada, not cheap, millions, some euros for a data center. And we had this in the architecture review board, and we had a feeling for the size of that location, for the data center, it seems pretty over-dimensioned. I forgot how many VMs they actually had, but it was like a few thousand virtual machines or something in this data center. Having like 1.x million just for the network infrastructure seems like a lot of money. Well, talking to the architect, the guy who came up with this was a very intelligent person. He basically, it came out to, they didn't want to be blamed in case something went wrong. They were being super risk averse because on a company that makes 11 billion profit, it's easier to spend another 500,000 euros than to get kicked by your boss, right? By saying, well, maybe you have larger failure domains, so if one of the switches goes up in thin air, right, you have a larger outage. So for them, they're just being extremely risk averse. Right? And it's easy to say, oh, this is a silly architecture. So no, for what they were after, it was exactly the right architecture because they were like, minimize blame on me. That was the driving requirement for the architecture. Now, having that discussion in the architecture review board and having me as chief architect there, I basically voted as like, well, who here would be in favor of taking one layer out of this architecture, basically collapsing this one layer, saved like 400,000 euros or something. Basically, everybody said, it's going to be fine, right? I mean, these switches have like mean time between failure of 50,000 hours anyway. They're all redundancy. There's always two switches. They're like, it's going to be fine anyway. So I said, great. Then we'll go with this solution. And if anybody throws any rock at this, send them straight to me. Right? You don't have to stand up for this and defend this. If your boss says, oh, this was a dumb thing to do or whatever problem they have, send them straight to me and I say, listen up. We had all the smartest people in the company in one room. We all said this is the right thing to go, and we went with it. I don't know how we could have made a better decision. Right? So in the end, you can give people help and support also in these review meetings. It's not just like putting extra blocks or something in their way, but actually defending them in case somebody questions their decision. So this is one nice example where we were able to provide value in this usually not very beloved review meetings. Cool. So we're almost at the end of our value chain. We have two more important parts, and that is, it's not going to go like you planned. Right? And this is a big theme at this event anyway, right? It's a lot about getting feedback and adjustment cycles, and that is not any different in enterprise architecture either. Likewise, it's one of the biggest challenges for enterprise architecture because your feedback cycles are slow. Right? If you found out 4 years later that you should have had that other layer in the network architecture, that's a little bit late. So the best thing that we did is we made sure that our architecture team doesn't sort of sit on top. Right? The classic picture of central enterprise architecture is here's the organization, and then enterprise architecture is on top. We didn't like that picture. We basically made an enterprise architecture team that works at all technical layers. We had infrastructure architects. We have people on call. We build real platforms, and that gave us a much closer connection to the reality and gave us a much better feedback cycle. Right? Because in the end, you need the signals, you need the feedback in order to steer what you're actually doing. And the very last one, and almost most important one is, so you think if I do all this, it's fantastically great, but you forgot the people, right? And no matter how much money you have, you can make like 11 billion profit a year, you won't have enough people with the right skill set. Right? And that's because stuff keeps changing, stuff keeps evolving, right? This is a problem that you can't solve with money and that you shouldn't solve with money alone. So in the end, mentoring and sharing and growing skill set and giving an identity to the architects and the architects team was a huge part of what I did there. So we started writing papers around it. I mentor people, I coach people, we speak at conferences together, right? So there's a lot of human element, right? This is not a simple top-down thing where you tell people what to do, right? You need to help create the base, and what you bring to the people shouldn't just be commands like, oh, put everything in a Docker container, but it should also be really mentoring and growing, because that's in the end what will make the organization successful. Right? This is the last, but by far not the least element of this value chain. So that's, as we said, it goes by really understanding the business strategy, mapping that to an IT strategy, developing a target picture out of that, making a roadmap towards that target picture, then having some governance to make sure that reality matches that roadmap, and then ultimately that you get feedback and calibrate, and don't forget to mentor and coach the people along the way, because only that way this whole thing can become reality. Now it's time to look inside the head of one of these enterprise architects. Like, what kind of thinking do you need to have? What do you need to do to do a good job at this? Right? And in the end, we try to distill this down to 3 main factors. It's a lot about the connections, it's a lot about abstractions, and it's about making decisions. Before we go there, do a tiny little bit of an exercise. So let's say you're the enterprise architect or an IT architect, and you meet the CEO in the elevator. So classic elevator pitch. And CEO says, well, what do you do here? So first you need to be clever enough to realize that when a senior executive asks you what do you do, they don't mean what do you actually do, right? It's like, oh, I come in the morning, I log on, I open PowerPoint, draw some nice pictures, right? That's not what they want to know. They want to know what value you bring to the organization, right? So translate this into, okay, you're the architect, what value do you bring to the organization? Well, right now you have, like, depending how many floors your building has, right? You have like 30 or 60 seconds to make a convincing pitch, right? And if you start talking about Docker containers and CI/CD, probably difficult for the CEO to understand. So we had this exercise once where a senior executive asked somebody, and they started talking about, architecture. It's, the components and constraints and rules, whatever, some like IEEE 1471 definition of software architecture. And the executive was like, whoa, I wish I hadn't asked, kind of thing. And then I said, no, architecture is very simple. Architecture is selling options. And in this case, we were lucky because the person we were talking to used to be the head of asset management, the insurance company, financials, that stuff they know. So it helps a lot to speak in the domain of your counterparts, right? If you work at a financial services organization, talking about options, that is for them, it's like what's Docker containers for us, right? That's all easy. Now this is the Black-Scholes formula. 2 very smart gentlemen got a Nobel Prize for this. And this is options pricing. So very condensed layman's explanation of how this works. Financial option is usually you acquire the right but not the obligation to make a future transaction at given parameters. So let's say you can buy the option to buy Allianz stock for 250 euros in 1 year. So currently it's like, I don't know, 196 or something, right? So you can say in 1 year, I am allowed to buy Allianz stock for a guaranteed price of 250. Now, when the year comes, it's very easy to decide if the stock is more than 250. Of course, you buy it for 250, you sell it for more, money in the bank. If it happens to be less than 250, you just don't buy it. You let the option expire, so to speak. Now, this option has a price, right? Because there's a chance, the stock will be higher than 250. So, there's a value, there's a price to this. Coming back to architecture, why are we selling options? Well, we're doing the same thing. How do you know a system has a good architecture? A system has a good architecture if in a year you can still make changes, new requirements, scaling out, right? Migrating to a public cloud, right? These are what makes a good architecture. These are options you buy. They cost a little bit of money, but they provide you value. So it's a classic wisdom that deferring decisions has value, and options is a clear example of this. Bring an IT example again. What is a classic example where architecture helps you defer a decision? Scale out, right? It used to be server sizing, right? Before people to launch anything, they do server sizing. They spend weeks and weeks on server sizing, and server sizing, unfortunately, only has 2 possible outcomes: too big or too small, right? So either you waste money, or the CFO will ring on your door. It's like, why are you buying all this hardware, right? Or the stuff doesn't perform. So a scale-out architecture is a classic example of deferring a decision. Now you can add hardware at will. You can scale out when you have the actual need. We all know this, but in the end, it's very much like giving people an option. You're selling people the option to add hardware later, and that has a value. So when the CEO asks, what do you do here? It says, oh, I sell options. And they will surely say, oh, please explain to me how this works. And you have a fantastic pitch. Now, in my case, we lucked out even more. And that was the head of asset management. Of course, this is his home turf. He said, aha, I like this analogy. And in a volatile market, the value of the options goes up. So this is something that I didn't know, but read up on Wikipedia. It's a little sigma in there. There's a sigma squared, another sigma there. So as the volatility goes up, the price of options goes up. The layman's explanation is a little bit, so let's say Allianz stock was like 200 euros for the last 100 years, buying an option for 250, maybe not that interesting, versus if there's a lot of movement in there, right, it might be more interesting, yeah, like layman's explanation. But basically, so my counterpart, you know, the head of innovation said, oh, I like the metaphor, and I know that in a volatile market, the value of the option goes up. Right now, we have a very volatile market, both in IT and in business, right? There's a lot of movement going on. So I should spend more money on architecture. Right? So that's the kind of conversation you want to have with your executives, right? Where they conclude themselves that, you know, they should be investing more because the options architecture provides you are now more valuable, right? Because if you have applications on the internet, there are more scale demands, right? If you build applications for 1,000 internal users, the option of horizontal scaling is not as valuable because it's 1,000 users. 2 get sick, fine, it's $9.98, right? Versus if you put stuff online, well, it's like 10 users today, 100,000 tomorrow, and 50 the day later, right? So in a volatile market, you can very easily see this option suddenly becomes much more valuable. And this is a great way to engage with management, saying that's why we do software architecture. But coming through the 3 main components, so talking about connections. So the key statement, and this comes from a chief architect, is that, you know, people really don't care about your system's architecture, right? They care about the properties that your system yields, that your architecture yields. And as we'll see, that largely comes from what connections you make. But these are very different kind of connections you will be making, right? You might be making connections between different layers in the organization. You know, this is what we said in the beginning, making sure, you know, business strategy, IT strategy, et cetera, is aligned, right? So you make sure things are connected over different layers of abstraction. You can also connect things between different applications, right? This is the data warehouse, data lake, et cetera, right? We talked about in integrated business models, integrating systems also has a high value. And then, you know, the third one is integrating different functions. So for example, we work very closely with procurement. Because procurement has one important property. If you want to spend a lot of money, you usually have to make it past procurement. And we had good friends in procurement, so if somebody came and was like, oh, I want to buy this monitoring software for $1 million, procurement said like, well, you surely aligned this with the central architecture team, right? And then I will get this email that says, oh, I think we need to have a quick phone conversation. It's like, well, I don't think this is going to be a quick conversation, right? So procurement was a great sort of, you know, safe stop for us when, you know, a lot of money was going to be spent on things that were not part of our roadmap, right? So those connections also hugely valuable. But coming back to why people don't care about the architecture, right? And this comes from a chief architect. People care about the properties of the system that are generally set by your architecture. So 2 systems here, fairly abstract. Do you think those 2 systems have different properties? Who thinks they have different properties? Wow, come on, all right? Counterexample. Who thinks they like behave exactly the same? Well, okay, let's be brave on why.
Just looking at different abstraction of the same problem, potentially.
Ooh, I could be looking at different abstractions for the same problem. I wasn't prepared for such a clever answer, so I'll talk to you afterwards. So very good though, right? This could be different viewpoints, right? It could be the same system, different viewpoints. Very, very good. So let's assume it's the same viewpoint, right? If it's the same viewpoint, the properties would be vastly different, right? So on the left-hand side, it's easy to replace one component, for example, because the dependencies are very clear. At the same time, you might have some more latency, and if one component fails, the whole thing is pretty much down. And the right-hand side is almost exactly the opposite, right? You have more direct connections, likely lower latency. If C fails, maybe you can still talk from A to D, which you can take on the left-hand side, but it's much harder to replace an individual element because you have more dependencies, right? So in the end, right, what does this tell us is it's not about the ingredients, it's about how they're put together, right? Like the whole property is changed just by the wiring. So I give the example, this is similar to a restaurant. So buying high-quality ingredients is a good thing, but you go to a good restaurant because they have a good chef. And what does the good chef do? The good chef puts the things together in the right way, right? You can give 2 chefs the same ingredients, and one will be great, and one won't be any good. So the architects are much more like the chefs. Our job is to understand how things are put together to yield certain properties, not to have a shopping list, right? Unfortunately, in IT architecture, too often times it's the shopping list. You say, oh, what is the architecture? WebLogic, WebSphere, right? That is not an architecture, that's a piece of a shopping list, right? So that is one important takeaway from this, right? It is about how you put things together. Second takeaway is, When somebody shows you an architecture diagram, so some viewpoint, and it has no lines, I will basically straight out reject it. So it can't be an architecture, right? Because the purpose of architecture is to yield some properties of the system. These properties of the systems are a function of how it's put together. So if you don't show me how it's put together, this is unlikely to be a useful architecture. So you can take this away. We once gave a training for top executives like CEOs, CFOs, because our CEO wanted them to be more IT savvy. And this is one thing we taught them, is if somebody walks up with some architecture picture that has no lines, even if you don't know much about IT, you can just raise your hand and say, I don't think this is an architecture, because there's no lines in there. So be careful, the word is spreading. Make sure your architecture pictures have some lines in them, right? And we did this seriously. So behold the lines, right? Give the lines their fair credit. Lines are important. Abstractions, right? So we deal with a ridiculous amount of complexity, and usually, and your point went back exactly there, is, so usually the way we conquer this complexity is by using abstractions, right? Now, when we see an architecture picture, it's almost always an abstraction. Yeah? It's a model of reality, because the real architecture is only in the system, right? And that's how we know every system has an architecture, right? You cannot build a system without an architecture because it inherently has one. The question is, do you consciously want to choose which architecture it has? There's many nice papers like the Big Ball of Mud, etc., who makes the argument that if you don't choose, you usually end up with one that you don't particularly like. So there's always an architecture, so the rest is all viewpoints. Now, why do you make these viewpoints? Well, you make these viewpoints in order to make a decision or improve your understanding, right? Why else would you make this, right? It's not an art class, right? Like here, right? In Pollock, very nice, right? It's not an art class. This is architecture. It's there to help us make better decisions or answer some questions. So when somebody comes with an architecture picture, first check you should do is, are there lines? And the second check is, well, what question is this picture answering? Right? Why you made this picture? Like, what decision does this help me make? What question does this help me answer? And if that leads to a lot of ho-hum, like, then something is wrong here, because why did you draw this picture? As I said, it's not art class. We draw pictures and abstractions because we want to answer questions and make decisions. And what kind of abstraction you need depends clearly on the question you're trying to answer. Here's a perfect example, right? Top left is like, well, what is sort of the easiest way to walk from Lower Village to Stowe, wherever that is, right? It answers that question very easily. And down here is, what is the fastest way to drive from Atlanta to Birmingham? Different questions, different maps, right? And you can't say one map is good and the other one is bad. So people came to me a lot as chief architect and say, is this a good architecture? Or is this a good architecture diagram? Like, I can't tell you because I need to know what question you're trying to answer. And if that isn't clear, we need to have a completely different discussion. Second part of this is, all these models are wrong, right? The model is not, this is not reality. It's not meant to be reality, right? I guarantee you the freeway between Atlanta and Birmingham is not bright orange, right? It's also probably not 2 miles wide. I mean, in the US, almost, but not quite, right? This is wrong, right? It is there to hide some complexity to help you make better decisions. And it's not about right or wrong. A model has to be wrong, because if it's completely right, it would match reality, and then it's no longer a model, right? So we always joke, what is the top right? What question does the top right model answer? And this is, how did Donald Trump win the election? But then, come to think about it, I don't think it really answers that. Right? So my one political joke for today, let's go back to enterprise architecture. So this is a model many people use when it comes to enterprise architecture. So this is a lot of these enterprise architecture frameworks. They will give you a data model like this. And the interesting thing is, we talked about making connections between layers of abstraction, and you can see this very nicely, right? You have business objects and business processes, and at some point you have software, device, and network. Right? And this lets you make things like, oh, do I have multiple applications for the same business function? Right? Or do I have business functions where I don't have an application, right? So these are tools and data models that people use in these famous enterprise architecture tools to come these insights. So it answers those kind of questions. It answers the questions, right? Do I have duplication? Do I have multiple applications for the same business function, right? Or should I have the same application for multiple business functions, right? It's another very valid question. So actually these tools are very useful. The challenge with them is they often take off a life on their own. So people put data into this tool no longer to answer the question, but to fill out the tool. And this is where this enterprise architecture thing usually takes the wrong turn, because people just start collecting information, but if this information never helps you answer a question, your value chain is broken. Right? You're not providing any value to the business. Sounds harsh because like, oh my God, I collected all this information. Well, if all this information doesn't help you make better decisions or give you a better insight, unfortunately, it has no value. Right? So be careful with these tools. Right? They're very helpful, but make sure you know who's the master and who's the tool. Make sure you're the master and the tool is the thing, not the other way around. It can happen very easily where the tool takes over and you sort of basically become the slave of the tool. So third part, so we talked about connections, we talked about abstractions, now it's about making decisions. Right? So here we have another simple test. Right? I like making things very simple. And the question is this architecture? So again, 50-50 chance of being right. So who says, yep, this is a proper architecture? Okay, or a third. So who says, no way. Well, okay, it's about even, interesting, okay. So ironically, is when you look at the popular definitions of architecture and software architecture, this will check in as correct, right? Because the Software Engineering Institute actually maintains a whole website with all the definitions of software architecture, but it's always the components, relationships, constraints, yada, yada. So this matches perfectly, right? The door is in the wall, conveniently reaches the floor, the windows are there, the roof is on the top, right? All the components are there, their relationships and constraints are clear and fulfilled, right? So yes. This is architecture. However, don't forget we're in a business, right? And in a business, the question is less about is this architecture, but the question is much more about would you have paid an architect for that? And now probably the hands, not so many hands are going up. Well, why not? Because there are no decisions here. There's no meaningful decision. This is absolute cookie cutter, off the shelf, right? There's nothing in there. Versus if you look at this house, which is almost identical, there it would flip, right? Now here's a conscious decision. The roof is much more pointed, and that's because it's in a cold climate, right? It says it reduces the pressure from the snow. It snows a lot. Snow is very heavy. It can either crush your roof or at least make your house leak. So what do? You make your roof pointed because gravity is one of our most renewable resources, right? It's like stuff works very well. Gravity takes the snow off, and of course you don't want the snow to go off the roof and come back through the window. So you make a nice overhang left and right so the snow goes off. And I would say that's enough to make this flip. Like good architecture doesn't have to be sort of 100 pages of complicated stuff. It's a few key decisions that are there that makes a difference between sort of meaningful architecture and not meaningful architecture. Now, of course, somebody could have been super clever and say everything has an architecture, so even this one would have been an architecture. And the other clever thing would be to say it can't be an architecture, it's only a viewpoint. But I made sure my storyline went quick enough that nobody can inject that. So next time you can bring the case and say it's just a viewpoint. Coming back to decisions though, right? Decisions that don't have a cost are not very meaningful. One of the worst things you can hear in an enterprise when you propose something is, oh yeah, that is really important. Right? That's about the worst thing you can hear, because saying that is really important doesn't cost anything. Right? People have the job of going in a lot of meetings and only saying, yeah, that's really important. Right? And unfortunately, people do make a career out of this. Right? Does happen. But that's not a commitment. Right? That is not a meaningful decision. So a meaningful decision, I like George Fairbanks' point of view. A meaningful decision is we know what's a priority. So there's a principle behind it. There's something we want. And therefore, we choose design X, or we choose design Y, and we accept downside Z. Like a decision that doesn't have any downside is likely to be not a very meaningful decision. So for example, with a pointy house, what is the downside of the pointy house? Well, IKEA won't sell a lot of furniture for your upper floor, right? Because your walls are like this, right? So there's a downside of this, and you might minimize that downside by saying, oh, I build my own furniture, whatever it is, right? But in the end, a decision should be driven by clear principles, and it should have a downside. If there's no downside, right, there's nothing to decide. So this is easily forgotten. And the next one on decisions is, in a large enterprise, it will never be easy to make a decision. There's a lot of fuzziness and uncertainty and complexity. So you need to divide and conquer. And you need to find something where you can focus, right, and start making some decision. You cannot boil the ocean. People often came to me and said, oh, did you know the people over there are doing X, Y, Z? And I'm just like, yeah, I can't be bothered. Like, oh, you're the chief architect, right? They're doing something that's not the standards. And I need to pick a focus, right? If you start skirmishes everywhere, you just get lost in the enterprise. So you need to find one part where you can focus, and you can really only then, if you divide and conquer, get to measurable outcomes. Right? If you start acting everywhere, boiling the ocean will not work. You need to pick something where you can make an outcome, because that's the only way, A, you create business value, and B, you can get feedback. Right? If you're always starting sort of meta stuff everywhere, you will never get the feedback whether this actually works. Now, there's some people who like doing that, but I don't call them enterprise architects. I call them like charlatans or something. Right? Sometimes we call them consultants. Right? Also happens. Coming to the end, right? So hopefully I've shown that sort of enterprise architecture is actually quite a bit to it. The amazing thing I always find is there's no black magic, right? It's about having the right models, understanding what we're trying to decide, evaluating the options, following the value chain, right? It seems all like, you don't need a PhD in enterprise architecture to follow this. However, people so easily get lost in the complexity, right? All this happens in a super complex, diverse domain. It's a moving target, and that is the real challenge. So I feel the main reason often this doesn't work very well is not because people don't understand what they're trying to do, but in the heat of the battle with all the complexity, they forgot where they are in this thing. So it's really kind of a discipline. It's kind of about having the discipline to come back to your sort of good common sense understanding and not forgetting where you are and what you're doing, and not allowing yourself to get lost in either the tooling or into the complexity. Last thought on this, right? We talked a lot about architecture and how having different viewpoints and abstractions makes you, in the end, be a better architect or do better architecture. I think the same is also true for your career. So I had quite a diverse career. I spent a lot of time as a consultant, right? So all consultant jokes aside, right? I worked in internet, software engineer at Google. I worked in corporate IT, right? So I've seen many different viewpoints. And I think just like when we look at the architecture of a system, having different viewpoints really helps you reason about it. And I think the same is true for the world of IT. Right? I think having these different viewpoints, having seen a large corporate IT from the inside out, having seen an internet giant from the inside out how they were, having seen a lot of organizations and consultants, that is also putting different viewpoints together. And I think in the end, this makes for a really interesting career. And if you have the ability to make those kind of connections, right? If you have the ability to have these different viewpoints and make these kind of connections, there's enormous career opportunities there for IT architects. And you would never have to be ashamed to carry the title enterprise architect, because in this case you'll be providing enormous business value, and the demand for those folks is extremely high. So with that positive thought, I would leave you for the rest of the event. If you enjoyed the stories, there's a book called 37 Things. Dave was right. I got to write 5 more to make it 42. So there's a book called 37 Things One Architect Knows About IT Transformation. A lot of stories, anecdotes, and opinions about what do architects do in a large enterprise. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you.